Anyway, good afternoon, and thank you for coming. It's my great pleasure to actually present my paper, The Effects of Oxide on Water and Friction of Rail Steel. There's two parts to this paper, really. I'm presenting a new test method, and then we're also looking at using this test method and seeing what we can get from it in terms of what's happening to the oxide on the railhead. And we're going to throw a bit of chemical analysis into there as well. So, this is what I'm going to do. Backgrounds show you a few of the railhead conditions that I've managed to find, go into a bit of the methodology, then discuss a few of my results, as well as bring it all together in a conclusion. So, a bit on the background. It's known that oxides can reduce the friction on the railhead. Traction is crucial and to safe and effective operation. It's very well known that a lot of the low adhesion incidents actually occur without any leaf contamination being present. So it's known by a lot of folks. Now, what is difficult about the oxide on the railhead is the mechanisms of which it reduces the adhesion aren't exactly well understood. No one knows particularly how it's actually caused, and they're incredibly difficult to reproduce. So my aims are first to determine and simulate the trackside conditions. I want to figure out what chemicals are there, and then and how they've actually got here, as well as what the conditions are during these low adhesion effect incidents. And secondly, I want to produce a method to better understand these effects. Now, a lot of the limitations of the current test methods for oxides is that these conditions are very easily removed. They can be very fragile, and they'll only last a very short amount of time under very specific conditions. So I want to do a single pass to make sure that I've actually covered them before they're destroyed, but also I want to be able to visualize the coefficient of friction on the railhead and actually see what individual parts of the contact are actually doing. And furthermore, I want to explore the presence and the Treiber properties of these individual oxides. So how magnetite or hematite or any of the other iron oxide hydroxides will actually have an effect on the railhead. Starting with the railhead conditions, we analyzed the railhead conditions by doing some track swabbings. We took some swabs off the surface of the railhead, and we found and then analyzed them using XR diffraction. We found a variety of oxides. Here we are: magnetite, magmahamite, hematite, goethite, and so on. Furthermore to this, we actually wanted to see what the conditions were, the environmental conditions. So we produced a data logger that actually recorded conditions. One of the main things that we found is that during the day and night, the temperature of the railhead actually lags behind the temperature of the environment. And during the points that are highlighted in red here, we've actually found that these actually fall below the dew point of the environment. This means that there's going to be a net condensation onto it, so you'll get dew. So we took these conditions, and then we tried to actually replicate them in the lab by controlling the humidity and the temperature. So here are our steel samples that we've actually put into environmental chambers consisting of saturated salt solutions to imitate different changeable conditions. And secondly, what we did is we dropped oxides of specific individual types onto these steel samples as well to see if we can actually run them through and figure out how the individual oxides are changing the Treiber properties. So the chemical analysis that we did and the surface analysis is, first of all, we looked at these oxides using X-ray diffraction. So what actually forms during these different conditions? We then got into scanning electron microscopy to actually look a little bit more into the contacts and see where these oxides are present. Here are a few very pretty pictures of crystals actually forming of different iron oxides based upon some of the samples that we've produced. From goethite to lepidocrosite. And thirdly, we actually looked at the different roughnesses based upon surface topography. The new methodology for the Treiber testing, we actually, instead of going the traditional method where you're sliding one way, the other way, one way, the other way. We wanted to actually be able to actually trace a contact track over the sample itself, and so that we could always be contacting new surface, new oxide. So with this, we can also produce a map over the surface, which we can actually compare to an image on this. I'll come back to this momentarily, but quickly talk about the results of the synthesized oxides, which is we found many different oxides are actually present. However, with a few of the oxides that we actually found were present actually on the railhead are missing from these conditions here. So when we actually looked at the synthesized oxides, we found that increasing the degree of oxidation overall actually increased the coefficient of friction over the surface. So running from the controlled sample on the left, where there was no oxidation synthesized on it, through to the to conditions where we had mixed conditions of both having dew form on the surface, but also simulating some form of rain on the surface. So if we look into these details a little bit more and actually look at the coefficients of friction maps that we've got, then we can see that, the top is a control sample and the bottom is a sample that's been heavily oxidized. We can see this increase in friction over the surface. The colors more towards the yellow side are actually higher coefficients of friction. However, what we do notice when we're looking at these samples that have actually been heavily oxidized is that outside of the oxidized pitted areas, we do get formation of some really low coefficient of friction. So just pointing this out here, in the pitted areas, we get an increased roughness, which then causes the increased area, the increased coefficient of friction. However, outside of these areas, we do get a quite substantial decrease in the coefficient of friction due to this, the oxide being present there. Now, coming back to the oxides that we deposited individually on there, we tried them out with this method. We both used distilled water to deposit them in a solution and then let that dry out. However, these results, we don't necessarily trust them simply because it varied the degree of oxidation of the surface. Fortunately, we couldn't really find a great deal out from that. The isopropanol we also used as a solution to deposit the oxides, and there we got a much more stable result. However, what we found is that the contact itself between the ball and the plate actually seemed to be plowing through the oxide, and so it seems that this mechanism was the one which was causing such a high increase of friction. The thinner magnetite layer, for instance here, which was substantially thinner than the others, actually has a reduced coefficient of friction, probably because of this. It is a bit problematic actually trying to use this method to actually study these oxides through this. So to bring all this together, the coefficient surface mapping actually produces some quite interesting and useful insight into these contacts. We can actually see what the individual areas which a non-homogeneous surface is actually producing. So where the oxide is causing the friction to increase and where it's causing it to lower down. And it also allows us to basically run a single pass over a surface, whereas it wouldn't be possible, for instance, in the twin disk testing, because you're continuously rolling over the same surface and it's removing what has already been there. From our XRD, comparing the swabs to the ones that we've actually synthesized in the labs, we found that because there's a huge difference between the amount of oxides that we found that we've been able to synthesize, then because our conditions were incredibly controlled, we only used distilled water. In the presence of only water, then we found that it produces quite a limited amount of oxides, predominantly lipidocrosite. Through looking at these coefficients of friction maps, we found that pitting due to the oxidation increases the coefficient of friction. However, lower friction was observed within these heavily oxidized samples, but outside of the areas which we found that are heavily pitted. And finally, looking at the methods for testing the individual oxides, we believe that there are better actually methods for doing this. So we will be testing it on larger contacts, for instance, a full-scale contact, but also using a larger sample or doing a rolling sliding test. Thank you for listening, and any questions, please?